What I'd like to do now is review blood typing. And specifically what I want to talk about are the ABO blood groups. The ABO blood groups are by far the most common blood groups worldwide. And within this blood group, you can be type AB, type B, type A, or type O. So the question now is, what determines which one of these blood types you are? And the answer to that is the presence or absence of antigens on your red blood cells. So let's take a look at this type B individual. The reason this person is a type B blood type is because they have type B antigens that are located on their red blood cells. The reason this is a type A individual is because they have type A antigens that are located on their red blood cells. What if you have both of those? What if you have both type B and A antigens that are located on your red blood cells? Well, then you're type AB. And what if you don't have either of these? What if your red blood cells don't have A or B antigens on it, like the case is right here? Well, that makes you a type O individual. And if we look at the chart here, that's what this chart is showing us. Here's the blood groups, and right next to the blood groups, it shows us the antigens that are going to be present on those individuals' red blood cells. So the presence of the antigen determines the blood type. Now, another thing that I want to talk about here are plasma antibodies related to these ABO blood groups. And let's look at the type B individual here. So what these antigens are is they're cell surface markers. They're markers on the cells that allow the immune system to recognize these cells as our own, as opposed to being foreign cells. Now, related to that, the immune system is also going to produce antibodies to recognize red blood cells that are not our own. So within the ABO blood group here, you can produce either anti-A antibodies or anti-B antibodies. Anti-A antibodies are going to recognize A antigens and they're going to attack them. Anti-B antibodies are going to recognize B antigens, and attack them. So let's take a look at the, let's use the type B individual as an example. So the type B individual has B antigens. Now what they don't have are anti-B antibodies, because if that was the case, then they would attack their own antigens, and we don't want that. So they do not have those. Instead, what they have are anti-A antibodies. The type A individual, they're going to have anti-B antibodies. The type AB individual, they're not going to have either of those antibodies. What would happen if they had anti-A antibodies? Then they'd attack those A antigens. What if they had anti-B? They would attack those B antigens, and we don't want either of those things to happen. And so they don't have either of those. What about type O though? Type O has both anti-A and anti-B antibodies because they don't have either of those antigens on those red blood cells. Now I want to relate these antibodies to transfusion reactions. So if you're a type B individual, who can you receive blood from and have it be a safe transfusion? Well, let's take a look at this. So you're a type B individual So you're going to be the recipient, and we want to know who the donors can be. Well, what would happen if you got a donation from a type A individual? And by the way, when you donate blood, that blood is spun down, and these red blood cells are packed together, and they only donate the red blood cells. They don't donate the antibodies that are with that donor. That would cause an additional level of complications. So it's only the red blood cells that are donated. So the question here is, what would happen if a type A individual gave blood to a type B individual? Is that acceptable? And the answer is no, because what would happen is these anti-A antibodies would attack those A antigens, and what you get in response to that is called an agglutination reaction, where these antibodies here attack the foreign red blood cells and they clump them all together and prepare them for destruction. And this agglutination can be dangerous on multiple levels, but one of the things that can happen is when these red blood cells clump up and they circulate through the vasculature, they can get down to those smaller vessels, those smaller arteries, and they can plug them up. They can occlude them. And that cuts off blood supply to any of the downstream tissues. So a type B individual cannot receive blood from type A. What about from a type AB? What would happen if type AB gave blood there? Well, again, these anti-A's would attack the A antigen. So that's not something we can do either. What about the type O? What would happen if a type O individual donated blood to a type B? Would that be acceptable? And the answer is yes, because there's no antigens on this type O individual for the type B individual to attack. Okay, these anti-A antibodies would have nothing to attack. So that is an acceptable donation. So who can a type B individual receive blood from? They can receive blood from an O individual and also a B individual, from another B individual, because another B individual, again, is just going to have B antigens and they won't have any A antigens on them. Okay, so that same concept goes for a type A individual. A type A can receive blood from another type A or a type O, again. What about a type AB individual? Can a type AB individual receive blood from a type from a type B here? The answer is yes, because there's no antibodies there to attack those Bs. What about from a type A individual? Again, the answer is yes, because there's no antibodies here to attack the A antigens. And what about from an O? The answer is yes there as well. So a type AB individual can receive blood from any of the blood groups, and that makes them the universal recipient. What about a type O individual? Can a type O individual receive blood from a type B? The answer is no, because of these anti-B antibodies. Same thing goes for blood from a type A. That's not acceptable. Same thing goes from a type AB individual. That's not acceptable as well. So the only person that a type O individual can receive blood from is another type O individual. But what you'll notice about O, they can only receive blood from O, but they can donate to anybody. So they're considered the universal donor. Now you may notice something. We have these type A, B, A, and O blood types, but when you go get your blood type taken, there's something else in addition to that AB blood group. There's either a positive or a negative. And what that positive or negative is referring to is another blood group called the RH blood group. And if you have an antigen called the RH factor on your red blood cells, then you're considered RH positive, and they put that positive at the end of the ABO blood group. If you do not have that RH factor, then you're considered RH negative, and they put that negative sign in back of your ABO blood group. The next thing I want to do is actually do some blood typing of some individuals, and that's what we have going on here. We have 4 individuals, and each of these individuals have 2 drops of blood here. And to the first drop of blood, we add an anti-A antibody, and to the second drop of blood, we add an anti-B antibody. Then we mix all that together, and we look for a reaction, and we're able to blood type based on that. So let's take a look at individual number 2 here and blood type individual number 2. And specifically what I want to do is let's take a look at this first drop of blood here. So these are all red blood cells in this first drop of blood. And what they did to this drop of blood is they added anti-A antibody. And they added anti-A antibody, they mixed it all around, and they looked for a reaction. And just looking at this drop of blood here, did we get a reaction? We did. We got an agglutination reaction. Now, what does that tell you about these red blood cells that we added anti-A antibody and we got an agglutination reaction? What that tells you is that there has to be A antigens located on these red blood cells. The only way we're going to get an agglutination reaction when you add anti-A is if you have A antigens on those red blood cells. So what does that tell you about that individual? That that individual is at least a type A blood. What about this second drop of blood here? This second drop of blood they added anti-B antibody. And did we get an agglutination reaction? The answer is no. So what does that tell you about these red blood cells here? Are there B antigens on that red blood cell? And again, the answer is no, because if there were, you would have gotten an agglutination reaction, and that's not what we're looking at here. So is this person a type B blood? The answer is no. So let's go through here and let's blood type these individuals. What about individual number 1 right here? What blood type is individual number 1? They are AB. What about individual 2? Type A. Individual 3? Type B. And what about individual 4 where we got no agglutination reactions? That means that this individual doesn't have A or B antigens, which makes them a type O. Now the other thing that we want to test for is the RH factor. positive or negative. And this is another test over here. This is an individual. These are 3 drops of blood. And to this drop, they added anti-A. Here they added anti-B. And here they added the RH factor. Or sorry, they added an antibody for the RH factor. And the antibody they add there is called anti-D. And then they do the same thing. They stir it up and they look for a reaction. And so based on that, what is this person's blood type going to be? This person is B negative. What about this individual down here? And again, anti-D is testing for the RH factor. This individual is A positive. The last thing I want to talk about is the RH factor as it relates to pregnancy, because it can cause some complications with pregnancy. And specifically that can occur when you have an RH negative mother and an RH positive fetus. Now in this scenario here, this is the first pregnancy for the mother. And so the mother's RH negative, she does not have those D antigens on her red blood cells, but now she has a fetus that does. This is an RH positive fetus. And what can happen is that during birth, when the placenta separates, that some of this blood from the RH positive fetus can get into the bloodstream of the mother. Now, something that's different about the RH factor is that the body doesn't start producing antibodies until it's initially exposed to it. That's not the case with the anti-A and the anti-B antibodies. So what happens is that after this first pregnancy, the mother starts producing these anti-D antibodies. And where we can run into complications here is if the woman becomes pregnant again and the fetus again is Rh positive. Because now what happens is these anti-D antibodies can get into the fetus's bloodstream and they can attack the red blood cells of the fetus. And as you can imagine, that can result in severe complications. And that's called hemolytic disease of the newborn. And so what they do as a precaution is they can give you a shot during your first pregnancy. It's a RhoGAM shot. And what that does is it prevents the mother from producing anti-D antibodies, even if the fetus is Rh positive.